He was shy and fell for the most beautiful woman in town, not knowing she was even shyer than him. Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. Marlo James stood before the antique mirror in her shop, adjusting a bright yellow dress that seemed to catch every ray of morning sunlight streaming through the storefront windows. The dress was perfect, cheerful, inviting, exactly what everyone expected from the owner of his sweet yesterdays, Fairhaven's beloved vintage clothing store. But in the reflection, she caught a glimpse of something else. That familiar shadow in her eyes, the one she'd become an expert at hiding behind carefully curated smiles. Looking radiant as always, dear, Mrs. Henderson called out as she browsed through a rack of 1950s scarves. The elderly woman had been a regular since Marlo's mother ran the shop, back when Marlo was just a girl who spent afternoons doing homework between racks of vintage dresses. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." Marlo's response came with practiced ease, accompanied by the warm smile she'd perfected over years of customer service. She moved away from the mirror, focusing instead on reorganizing a display of vintage brooches that didn't really need reorganizing. The shop bell chimed, and Marlo looked up to see the delivery man from Main Street Express, holding a package that was definitely not the collection of vintage buttons she'd been expecting. "Delivery for..." He squinted at the label. "Sweet Yesterdays. That's odd." Marlo approached, examining the large, flat package. "I was expecting something much smaller. Computer says it's for this address." The delivery man shrugged, already halfway out the door. "Sign here, please." After signing, Marlo carried the mysterious package to her workstation at the back of the shop. The sender's address caught her eye. Hartwell Restorations, 42 Pine Street. She'd passed that little workshop countless times on her morning walks, but had never ventured inside. Something about the quiet, almost secretive nature of the place had always intrigued her. When she carefully opened the package, her breath caught. Inside was a photograph frame, but not just any frame. It was an ornate piece from the early 1900s, its wooden details telling stories of craftsmanship long forgotten. But what made her heart skip wasn't the frame itself. It was what was missing from it. The glass was gone, and in its place was a note written in careful, measured handwriting. "The original glass was beyond repair. I've ordered a replacement that will preserve the frame's historical integrity while protecting whatever memories you choose to keep within it. It should arrive next week. S. Hartwell." Marlo ran her fingers along the frame's delicate edges, feeling the places where time had left its mark. Something about the care taken in its restoration, about the thoughtfulness of that note, made her think about the old photograph hidden in the bottom drawer of her desk at home, the one she'd never had the courage to frame. "Oh my, that's absolutely gorgeous." Mrs. Henderson had appeared at her elbow, startling Marlo from her reverie. "Perfect for displaying family photos." "It's actually not mine," Marlo admitted, reluctantly pulling her hands away from the frame. "It was delivered here by mistake." She glanced at the clock. 4:45 p.m. The shop closed at 5:00, and she knew Hartwell Restorations would be closing soon too. Making a decision, she carefully rewrapped the frame. "Mrs. Henderson, would you mind if I stepped out a few minutes early? I should return this before they close." The walk to Hartwell Restorations was short, but felt longer with each step. Marlo had passed the workshop hundreds of times, always wondering about the quiet figure she sometimes glimpsed through the window, bent over some treasure in need of repair. Now, standing before the weathered blue door with its brass knocker, she felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. The windows glowed warm against the approaching evening, and through the glass she could see someone working at a bench, completely absorbed in whatever delicate task lay before them. Marlo hesitated, her hand halfway to the door. For a moment, she considered leaving the package on the doorstep with a note of her own. But before she could decide, the figure inside looked up. Their eyes met through the window, and something shifted in the air, like the moment before rain when the world holds its breath. The man inside, Silas Hartwell, she presumed, seemed as startled as she felt, as if he too had been caught in a private moment. For several heartbeats, neither of them moved. Then slowly he stood and made his way to the door. Marlowe noticed how carefully he moved, as if every step was considered intentional. When he opened the door, the small brass bell above it rang softly, a gentler sound than the one in her own shop. Marlowe started, then paused, suddenly aware of how the yellow dress felt too bright, too loud for this quiet moment. There was a mix-up with the delivery. She held out the package, noticing how his hands, stained with various shades of wood stain and varnish, hesitated before taking it. "The Morrison frame," he said softly, recognition flickering in his eyes. His voice was low, pleasant, with a slight roughness as if it wasn't used often. It was supposed to go to Rose Lane, not Main Street. He looked down at the package, then back at her, and Marlowe saw something familiar in his expression. The same careful mask she wore, but a different style. "I opened it," she admitted, "before I realized the mistake." "It's beautiful work." A slight color rose to his cheeks. "Thank you." He shifted the package in his arms, and Marlowe noticed a small scar on his right hand, probably from his work. You run Sweet Yesterdays." "Yes, Marlowe James." She offered her name like a gift, surprised by how natural it felt. "Silas," he returned, just as carefully. "Silas Hartwell." The moment stretched between them, comfortable despite its silence, or maybe because of it. Finally, Marlowe took a small step back. "I should let you get back to your work." Silas nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a question, perhaps, or a wish. "Thank you for bringing this by," he said, and Marlowe heard all the other things he wasn't saying. As she walked back to her shop in the golden evening light, Marlowe found herself thinking about frames, how they could either confine or enhance what they held, depending on how you looked at them. And she thought about the photograph in her desk drawer, the one she'd never had the courage to display. Maybe, she thought, it was time to find the right frame for it. 3 days after the misdelivered package, Marlowe found herself standing in front of Hartwell Restorations again, this time clutching a stack of papers that threatened her family's legacy. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street, and through the workshop's window she could see Silas bent over his workbench, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose, as he carefully applied gold leaf to what looked like a picture frame. She'd spent the previous night poring over the bank statements, searching for a way to keep Sweet Yesterdays afloat. The numbers didn't lie. Foot traffic had dropped significantly in the past 6 months, and online competition was eating into their traditional customer base. The store that her grandmother had opened in 1962, that her mother had transformed into a Fairhaven institution, was now teetering on the edge of becoming just another empty storefront. Before she could second-guess herself, Marlowe pushed open the door. The gentle bell chime made Silas look up, and she watched a surprise, then recognition, then something warmer flickered across his face. "Miss James," he said softly, removing his glasses and setting them beside an array of delicate restoration tools. "Marlowe," she corrected, managing a smile that felt more genuine than the one she'd been wearing lately. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Silas shook his head, gesturing to a wooden chair near his workbench. It was old, like everything else in the shop, but had been lovingly restored to reveal the beauty of its original craftsmanship. Marlowe sat, noticing how the morning light streaming through the window caught the dust motes in the air, making them dance like tiny stars. "I have a rather unusual request," she began, smoothing her emerald green dress, another armor of cheerfulness she'd put on that morning. I was wondering if you restore anything besides frames and furniture." Silas tilted his head slightly, an invitation to continue. "You see, there's this ledger." Marlowe pulled out a leather-bound book from her stack of papers. Its spine was cracked, its pages yellowed and threatening to fall out. "It belonged to my grandmother. She recorded everything in it when she first opened Sweet Yesterdays. Every purchase, every sale, every little victory and setback. She ran her fingers along the worn cover. I thought, maybe if you could restore it, it might help me figure out how she did it, how she kept the store going through harder times than these. Understanding dawned in Silas's eyes. He held out his hands, and Marlowe passed him the ledger. His touch was gentle as he examined it, fingers tracing the deteriorating binding with the same care she'd seen him give to the frame days before. "It's more than just a book, isn't it?" he asked quietly. Marlowe nodded, fighting back the sudden tightness in her throat. "It's the heart of the store. Every important moment is in there, including the day my mother took over and later when she couldn't finish the sentence, but Silas's eyes told her she didn't need to. A comfortable silence fell between them as Silas continued his examination. Finally, he reached for a notebook and began sketching out what looked like repair plans. "The binding can be restored," he said, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke about his craft. "The pages need to be reinforced, but we can do it without losing any of the writing. It'll take time, though, maybe 2 weeks." 2 weeks, Marlowe repeated, trying to keep the worry from her voice. The bank wanted answers sooner than that. Silas must have heard what she wasn't saying because he looked up from his sketching. "I could show you some techniques for preserving other old books. While you wait," he spoke haltingly, as if each word was carefully chosen, "if you'd like to learn." The offer surprised her. From what she'd gathered asking around town, Silas rarely invited anyone into his workspace for more than brief consultations. Yet here he was, offering to share his knowledge, his space. "I'd like that," she found herself saying. He nodded, then turned to a shelf behind him. "Coffee?" he asked, gesturing to an ancient percolator that somehow looked perfectly at home among the antiques. "Please." As Silas prepared the coffee, Marlowe noticed a small collection of frames on a side table, each one waiting for its glass replacement. One in particular caught her eye, a simple wooden frame with delicate carved leaves along its edges. It reminded her of the photograph still hidden in her desk drawer at home. "But these are all waiting for new glass?" she asked. Silas nodded, returning with 2 mugs of coffee. His was black, hers had a splash of cream, though she hadn't told him how she took it. "People trust me with their memories," he said quietly. "Sometimes the frames hold the only copy of a precious photograph. Getting the right glass, the right fit. It matters, like getting the right words," Marlowe suggested, thinking of all the things she struggled to say out loud. Their eyes met over their coffee cups, and in that moment, Marlowe felt truly seen for the first time in years. Not the carefully curated version of herself she presented to the world, but the woman who still grieved her mother, who feared losing her family's legacy, who sometimes wanted to hide behind the racks of vintage clothes instead of selling them. "Sometimes," Silas said after a long moment, "the wrong words can do more damage than broken glass." He picked up the frame she'd been admiring. "But the right frame, it can help you see things differently, make you brave enough to display what you've been keeping hidden." Marlowe felt her breath catch. Did he somehow know about her hidden photograph, or was he just speaking from his own experience of hiding behind careful silences? Before she could respond, the shop's bell chimed again. An elderly man entered, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile at the sight of them. "Well, well, if it isn't our 2 favorite shopkeepers sharing a morning coffee." "Good morning, Mr. Collins," Silas said, and Marlowe noticed how his shoulders tensed slightly at the interruption. "Morning, Richard," Marlowe added. Richard Collins had been their next-door neighbor since before she was born, and his wife had been one of Sweet Yesterday's most loyal customers before she passed away last spring. "Don't let me interrupt," Richard said, his eyes twinkling. "Just dropped by to see if you'd finished with Claire's old music box, Silas. No rush, though, no rush at all." He winked at Marlowe before making his way back to the door, humming a tune that sounded suspiciously like an old love song. After he left, the silence between Marlowe and Silas felt different, charged with something new, something neither of them was quite ready to name. Marlowe glanced at her watch and stood, gathering her papers. "I should get back. The store opens in 20 minutes. Come by tomorrow morning." Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll show you how to start preserving the ledger's pages." Marlowe nodded, clutching her coffee cup like an anchor. Same time, same time. As she walked back to Sweet Yesterdays, Marlowe realized she felt lighter despite the weight of her financial troubles. Something had shifted in that quiet workshop, between cups of coffee and unspoken understanding. She thought about what Silas had said about frames helping you see things differently. Maybe it was time to bring that photograph out of her desk drawer. Maybe it was time to let someone else see the parts of herself she'd kept carefully hidden away, protected like precious memories behind glass that no one else could see through. The morning restoration sessions with Silas had become Marlowe's anchor over the past week. Each day, she arrived at his workshop just as the sun was painting Fair Haven in shades of gold, and each day she found herself lingering a little longer over their shared coffee and comfortable silences. Today, she wore a dress the color of autumn leaves, its vintage-cut reminder of simpler times. As she worked beside Silas, carefully applying a mixture he'd prepared to strengthen the ledger's fragile pages, she couldn't help but notice how his hands moved with such precision, how his presence beside her felt both thrilling and peaceful at once. "You're getting better at this," Silas said softly, watching as she completed another page. His voice still carried that slight roughness, but he seemed to speak more easily now, at least when they were alone. "I have a good teacher." Marlowe smiled, then caught her breath as their fingers brushed while reaching for the same tool. Neither pulled away immediately, and in that brief touch, she felt more understood than in all the eloquent speeches her ex-fiancé had ever given her. The shop bell's gentle chime broke the moment Richard Collins entered, carrying 2 paper cups from Pearl's cafe and wearing a knowing smile that made Marlowe's cheeks warm. "I thought you two might need a morning boost," he said, setting down what turned out to be hot chocolate, his late wife's special recipe that Pearl still made on request. Claire always said nothing helps preserve memories like a cup of something sweet. "Thank you, Richard," Marlowe said, touched by the gesture. She'd spent countless afternoons with Claire Collins, listening to stories about Fair Haven's history while helping her try on vintage dresses at Sweet Yesterdays. "How's the ledger coming along?" Richard asked, settling into what had become his usual chair by the window. His presence had become as much a part of their morning routine as the coffee and quiet work. "We've stabilized most of the pages," Silas explained, showing Richard their progress. "The binding will take longer, but—" The shop bell rang again, and this time Marlowe's world tilted on its axis. "I thought I might find you here," said a voice she hadn't heard in 2 years, "though I must admit I checked the store first." Standing in the doorway was Maxwell Reed, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than a month's worth of Sweet Yesterday's rent. His smile was as practiced as ever, but his eyes held something calculating as they took in the scene before him. "Max!" Marlowe's voice came out steadier than she felt. "What are you doing in Fair Haven? Can't a man visit his hometown?" He stepped further into the shop, his expensive shoes incongruous against the worn wooden floor, especially when he hears that certain cherished institutions might be in trouble. Marlowe felt her stomach drop. She hadn't told anyone about the store's financial problems except Silas, unless the bank president is an old golf buddy, Max continued, confirming her fears. "He mentioned you might be looking for investors. I thought, who better to help than someone who knows the true value of family legacy?" The irony of those words, coming from the man who'd once told her she needed to think bigger than old dresses and small-town memories, wasn't lost on Marlowe. She was aware of Silas beside her, completely still but radiating a quiet intensity. Richard had straightened in his chair, all traces of his usual gentle humor gone. "I appreciate the concern," Marlowe said carefully, "but I'm handling the situation." Max's laugh held a touch of condescension, the same way you handled our relationship, by hiding behind your mother's store instead of embracing the opportunities I offered. The words hit their mark with practiced precision, 2 years ago, they might have made her question everything about herself. But now, I think Silas's quiet voice cut through the tension like a beam of light through stained glass, that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that can't be measured in dollar amounts. Max turned, as if truly noticing Silas for the first time. "And you are?" "Someone who understands the worth of what's worth preserving," Silas replied, his hand moving almost imperceptibly closer to Marlowe's on the workbench. A complex expression crossed Max's face: surprise, dismissal, and something that might have been jealousy. "Well, I'll be in town for a few days. When you're ready to have a serious discussion about the store's future, you know where to find me." He pulled out a business card, setting it precisely on the edge of Silas's workbench. "I'm staying at the Madison Hotel. Some things in this town have managed to keep up with the times. At least, after he left, the silence in the workshop felt heavy with unspoken words. Richard was the first to break it. "That young man," he said with unusual gravity, "never did understand the difference between price and value." Marlowe's hands were shaking slightly as she picked up her restoration tool again. Silas gently took it from her fingers, replacing it with his handkerchief, a soft, well-worn piece of fabric that somehow smelled of wood polish and safety. "I didn't know he was back," she said quietly, more to herself than to the others. I didn't know he kept tabs on the store." "Men like that," Richard observed, "often mistake ownership for love." Silas had moved to his desk and was pulling out what looked like old photographs of sweet yesterdays, carefully preserved in archival sleeves. "Your grandmother," he said, showing her a picture from what must have been the store's opening day. "She faced down the mall developers in '85. Your mother stood against the chain stores in '99. His voice grew stronger with each word. "The store survived because they understood something Max Reed never will." "What's that?" Marlowe asked, drawn to the quiet conviction in his voice. "That some things are meant to be preserved, not changed, protected, not replaced." He paused, then added so softly she almost missed it. "Like you." The words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. She looked at Silas, really looked at him, and saw in his eyes everything he wasn't saying, that he saw her strength, not her fear, her wisdom in choosing what to preserve, not her reluctance to change. Richard cleared his throat. "Well, I should check on those flowers Claire planted in the springtime. They need regular tending, you know, regular, lengthy tending." He winked as he made his way to the door, humming a different love song than usual. In the quiet that followed his departure, Marlowe found herself standing closer to Silas than she'd realized. She could see the tiny flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that matched her own. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing what's worth preserving." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Marlowe understood that while Max had always tried to change her, Silas simply wanted to protect who she already was, like the perfect glass in a frame, keeping precious memories safe while letting their true beauty shine through. The business card still lay on the workbench, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the worn wood and gentle tools surrounding it. Marlowe picked it up, then deliberately dropped it into the wastepaper basket. "Now," she said, turning back to the ledger, "show me again how to strengthen these binding stitches." Silas's smile was small but real as he picked up his tools. And if their hands brushed more often than strictly necessary as they worked, well, some touches spoke louder than words ever could. The flyer on Marlowe's counter seemed to mock her with its cheerful announcement: Fairhaven Heritage Festival, celebrating 150 years of local business. She wore indigo blue today, a shade that reminded her of twilight, that liminal space between day and night where anything felt possible. But even her favorite vintage dress couldn't calm her racing thoughts. "They want every shop to participate," she explained to Silas during their morning restoration session. 2 weeks had passed since Max's appearance, and while he hadn't returned to the workshop, his presence lingered in Fairhaven like a storm cloud on the horizon. "There's going to be a town hall presentation where each business shares their history and vision for the future." Silas's hands stilled over the ledger's nearly restored binding. Public speaking. he said softly, and Marlowe heard everything he wasn't saying in those 2 words. I know. She touched his arm gently, a gesture that had become natural between them. I thought about declining, but she gestured to the stack of bills hidden beneath the flyer. The festival brings in half our annual tourist revenue. We need the exposure. We! The hope in his voice made her heart flutter. Well, you're part of this now too, she said, gesturing to the ledger they'd spent mornings restoring together. Actually, I had an idea about that. Silas tilted his head, waiting. What if we did a joint presentation? Sweet yesterdays and Hartwell restorations, showing how preserving the past helps build the future. The words tumbled out faster than she intended. We could display some of your restored pieces alongside our vintage clothing, show how both businesses are about keeping history alive. Marlowe, his voice was barely a whisper. And maybe create a special exhibition about local family heirlooms. Marlowe, firmer this time. She stopped, really looking at him. His face had gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of his workbench so tightly his knuckles were white. I can't, he said, speaking in front of people. He swallowed hard. The last time I tried, the shop bell's chime interrupted his confession. Richard entered, carrying his usual morning treats, this time fresh scones from Pearl's. I couldn't help but overhear, he said, setting down the pastries. You know, Silas, Claire used to say that some stories are too important to let fear keep them untold. This is different, Silas insisted quietly. Is it? Richard settled into his chair, his eyes kind but knowing. When Claire first asked me to speak at our wedding, I was terrified. Couldn't sleep for weeks thinking about all those people staring at me, but then she told me something I never forgot. Both Marlowe and Silas turned to him, drawn in by the gentle wisdom in his voice. She said, Richard, when you're speaking from the heart, you're not performing, you're sharing. And sharing is just like having a conversation with someone who understands. He smiled at them both. And I reckon you two know something about understanding without words. Marlowe watched as something shifted in Silas's expression. He reached for a small key hanging around his neck. She'd noticed he always wore it, but had never asked about it, and walked to a cabinet in the corner of his workshop. Inside were dozens of leather-bound notebooks. These are... He hesitated, then seemed to find strength in Marlowe's presence beside him. And these are all the pieces I've restored. Every story, every memory I've helped preserve. He pulled out one of the notebooks, opening it to reveal detailed sketches and notes. I write down everything, the history of each piece, the techniques used to save it, the families they belong to. Marlowe's breath caught as she understood. Your letters, she whispered. Silas looked up sharply. Mrs. Henderson mentioned it, she explained softly. She said you write beautiful letters about the pieces you restore, but you never send them. A flush crept up his neck. Words are harder when they're spoken. Then don't speak them. The idea came to Marlowe suddenly, clear as sunlight through stained glass. Show them. She grabbed a blank piece of paper from his desk and began sketching rapidly. We could create a display, your restoration pieces, my vintage clothing, all connected by the stories in your notebooks. The presentation doesn't have to be a speech. It could be a restoration, Silas finished, understanding dawning in his eyes, of Fairhaven's memories. Exactly! Marlowe's excitement grew as the vision took shape. We could have photos showing the before and after of your restorations, paired with the stories from your notebooks. I could display the vintage pieces that connect to those same families. And the ledger, Silas added, his voice growing stronger, showing how it's being preserved, like the town's history. Now that, Richard said, beaming at them both, sounds like a story worth telling. The rest of the morning flew by in a flurry of planning. Silas began selecting pieces from his collection, while Marlowe matched them with vintage items from her store that told complementary stories. They worked in perfect synchronization, their usual comfortable silence now charged with creative energy. As the sun climbed higher, Richard excused himself for his morning constitutional, which they'd learned was his tactful way of giving them privacy. Before leaving, he paused at the door. And you know what else Claire used to say? His eyes twinkled. Sometimes the best way to face your fears is to have someone to hold on to while you do it. After he left, Marlowe and Silas found themselves standing close together over their shared sketches and plans. The morning light caught the dust motes around them, creating a golden haze that felt almost magical. "We could practice," Marlowe offered gently, "just you and me, sharing the stories you've written. Like our morning coffee talks." Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, and Marlowe felt seen in a way that made her previous relationships feel like pale shadows. "Would you," he cleared his throat, "would you stay after closing time? We could work on it together." "Yes," she said simply, understanding all the layers in his request. He reached for her hand, hesitating just before touching it. Marlowe closed the distance herself, lacing her fingers through his. His palm was warm, slightly rough from his work, and somehow felt more familiar than her own. "There's something else," he said quietly, his thumb tracing small circles on her hand. "Something I've been wanting to show you, a restoration project I've been working on, but not for a client." "What is it?" "Come back tonight," he whispered. "Hadin, and I'll show you." As Marlowe walked back to Sweet Yesterdays later that morning, she realized she was humming the same love song Richard always did. Her indigo dress caught the sunlight, and for the first time since Max's return to Fairhaven, she felt truly hopeful about the future. But even as she unlocked her shop door, she couldn't help wondering, what was the project Silas wanted to show her? And why did his voice hold such a mix of fear and determination when he mentioned it? The evening wrapped around Fairhaven like a soft blanket, streetlights casting warm pools of gold on the empty sidewalks. Marlowe stood before her mirror at Sweet Yesterdays, second-guessing her decision to change into the 1950s burgundy dress she'd been saving for a special occasion. The color reminded her of aged wine and secret hopes, its style somehow both timeless and precisely right for tonight. A knock at the store's front door startled her from her thoughts. Through the glass, she saw Max's silhouette, and her heart sank. "Just checking if you'd reconsidered my offer," he said when she reluctantly let him in. His eyes took in her dress, a knowing smirk playing at his lips. "Though it seems you might be reconsidering other things as well. The store isn't for sale, Max." Marlowe moved behind the counter, needing the physical barrier between them. "No." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "The bank seems to think otherwise. Your loan application was denied this morning, but I'm sure your new friend already told you that." Marlowe's breath caught. "No, what are you talking about?" "Silas Hartwell sits on the bank's small business advisory board. Didn't he mention it?" Max's voice dripped false concern. Surely he knew about the decision before anyone else. The world tilted slightly. Silas had never mentioned any connection to the bank. Was that why he'd been so interested in the ledger, in helping her? Was this evening's invitation just his way of softening the blow? "And you're lying," she said, but uncertainty crept into her voice. "Am I? Check for yourself." He laid a document on the counter, an official bank letter with Silas's name clearly listed among the board members. "I always told you, Marlowe, you trust too easily, give your heart away too freely, but I'm still here, aren't I? Still trying to help, despite how things ended between us." The bell above the door chimed again, and Richard Collins stepped in, his usual cheerful expression hardening at the sight of Max. "Evening, Mr. Reed," Richard said, his voice carrying an unusual edge. "Isn't the Madison Hotel in the opposite direction?" "Just having a business discussion," Max replied smoothly. "It's about preserving valuable things." "Funny," Richard remarked, "how some folks confuse preserving with possessing." He moved to stand beside Marlowe, his presence solid and reassuring. "I believe Ms. James has an appointment to keep." Max's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, we'll continue this discussion later." He headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and Marlowe, that dress. I remember when you used to dress for success, not sentiment." After he left, Marlowe's hands trembled as she picked up the bank document. "Don't let him plant seeds of doubt," Richard said gently. Some men, when they can't possess something beautiful, try to tarnish it instead. But if Silas knew about the loan, she couldn't finish the thought. Then I suspect he has his reasons for not mentioning it. Richard's eyes were kind but firm. Go to him, Marlowe. Let him show you what he needs to show you. Trust what you've seen in his workshop, not what Max Reed wants you to see. The walk to Hartwell Restorations felt longer than usual. The evening air had turned cooler, and Marlowe wrapped her arms around herself, wishing she'd brought a shawl. Light spilled from Silas's workshop windows, and through the glass she could see him pacing, occasionally stopping to adjust something she couldn't quite make out. When she knocked, he jumped slightly, then hurried to let her in. He'd changed too, she noticed, a crisp blue shirt replacing his usual work clothes, though a small smudge of wood stain on his collar revealed his nervous adjusting. "You came," he breathed, as if he'd been afraid she wouldn't. "I came." She stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the workshop's familiar sense of wood polish and possibility. Then she saw what he'd been arranging, and everything else fell away. On his workbench stood an exact replica of Sweet Yesterday's original storefront, meticulously crafted in miniature. Every detail was perfect. The hand-painted sign, the bay windows, even the tiny brass doorknob she'd polished 1,000 times. But it was more than just a model. It was a shadow box of memories, with tiny compartments holding fragments of the store's history, a scrap of lace from her grandmother's first inventory, a button from her mother's favorite dress, a small dried flower that looked like it came from the bouquet at the store's opening day. How? She moved closer, discovering more details with each step. "How did you—" "Your grandmother," Silas said softly, coming to stand beside her. "She kept everything. In that ledger we've been restoring, pressed between the pages, tucked into the binding. I've been collecting them, preserving them properly." He swallowed hard. "I thought, for the Heritage Festival, but also for you." "You're on the bank's advisory board," Marlowe said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Silas stiffened, then slowly nodded. "I resigned this morning." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a letter. When they denied your loan application, I didn't want—" He took a shaky breath. "I couldn't be part of any decision that might hurt you." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to let me help you as just me, not as someone with influence or position, just as someone who understands what it means to preserve what matters." His voice grew stronger. "The bank doesn't see what I see when I look at Sweet Yesterdays. They see declining profits and outdated inventory. I see stories waiting to be preserved, memories waiting to be shared." Marlowe looked back at the miniature storefront, seeing it with new eyes. Each tiny detail was an act of love, not just for the craftsmanship, but for the history it represented, for her family's legacy, for her. "There's something else," Silas whispered, reaching for a small drawer built into the base of the model. "Something I've been trying to find the courage to show you." He pulled out a stack of letters, each one carefully dated and addressed to Sweet Yesterdays. To her, the top one was dated the day after she'd first brought him the misdelivered package. "I write them every night," he admitted, his voice barely audible, "about the things I wish I could say out loud, about how watching you with your customers reminds me that some things are worth preserving at any cost, about how your smile makes me believe that maybe my silence isn't a flaw, but just a different way of speaking." Marlowe's vision blurred with tears as she picked up the first letter. The words inside were everything she'd seen in his eyes during their morning coffee talks, everything she'd felt in their shared silences. "Max came to see me yesterday," Silas continued, his hands fidgeting with his ever-present key necklace. "Offered to buy my building, suggested I combine forces with his development company. When I refused, he implied that I was taking advantage of your vulnerability, using the store's troubles to what? To get close to you." The words seemed to pain him. "But Marlowe, I need you to know everything I feel for you, everything I've written in those letters. It's more real than anything I've ever tried to say out loud. Marlowe looked at the miniature store, at the letters, at the man who spoke so eloquently through his silence and his craft. Then she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the photograph she'd carried with her every day since their first meeting, the one she'd never had the courage to frame. It showed her mother on the day she'd given Marlowe the store, both of them laughing, surrounded by vintage dresses and morning light. She'd hidden it away after her mother's death, too afraid to display a happiness she thought she'd never feel again. "I think," she said softly, "it's time to find the right frame for this." Silas's eyes filled with understanding. Gently, he took the photograph, treating it with the same care he'd shown every piece of her family's history. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she agreed. And when his hand found hers, she felt the warmth of it spread through her entire being. The evening light painted shadows on the workshop walls as they bent over his workbench, choosing the perfect frame for her precious memory. And if some of his letters got slightly tear-stained as she read them, well, sometimes the most precious things carry marks of the journey they've taken to find their proper place. The Heritage Festival was 3 days away, and Sweet Yesterdays had transformed into a museum of memories. Marlowe wore seafoam green today, a color that reminded her of new beginnings, as she and Silas arranged their display pieces throughout the store. His restored furniture and frames mingled with her vintage clothing, each grouping telling a story of Fairhaven's past. "The Morrison wedding dress goes perfectly with your restoration of their family Bible," Marlowe said, adjusting the ivory lace gown beside the beautifully preserved book. "I can't believe their granddaughter is wearing it next month." Silas nodded, carefully positioning one of his notebooks open to sketches of the Bible's restoration process. They decided to display excerpts from his writing alongside each piece, letting his written voice tell the stories his spoken one found difficult to share. The bell chimed, and Pearl from the cafe bustled in, carrying a tray of coffee and pastries. "Thought you two could use breakfast," she announced, her eyes widening as she took in the transformed space. "Oh my, it's like stepping into a time capsule." "That's exactly what we're going for," Marlowe explained, accepting a coffee gratefully. "Each display tells a family story, how the pieces were preserved, what they meant to Fairhaven. And look at this." Pearl had discovered the miniature Sweet Yesterdays that now held pride of place in the front window. "Silas, you've outdone yourself." Silas ducked his head at the praise, but Marlowe saw the small smile playing at his lips. Over the past week, as they'd worked on the festival presentation, she'd watched him slowly grow more comfortable with sharing his work. His silence was still there, but it felt less like a wall and more like a gentle curtain, drawing back whenever he felt safe enough to let someone in. The bell chimed again. This time it was Richard, looking unusually serious. "Town council meeting just ended," he said without preamble. Max Reed presented his vision for downtown revitalization, complete with plans to turn this whole block into what he calls a heritage-themed shopping experience. Marlowe's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "He can't just... He's got investors," Richard continued. "Big ones. He's promising to preserve the character of the historic buildings while modernizing their functionality." The disgust in his voice made the corporate speak sound like curse words. "The bank loan," Silas said quietly. "They denied it because they knew about this." Pearl's face had gone pale. "He stopped by the cafe yesterday. Talked about franchise opportunities and authentic local flavor. I thought he was just being his usual pompous self, but he's trying to buy the whole street," Richard confirmed. "Already made offers to half the business owners. Above market value, too." Marlowe looked around her store, at the displays she and Silas had created, at the memories they'd woven together, at the stories waiting to be told at the festival. "This isn't just about preserving buildings," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It's about preserving the heart of Fairhaven." The bell chimed a third time. Max stood in the doorway, looking more corporate than ever in his tailored suit. "I see you've all heard the news," he said, stepping inside as if he already owned the place. "I came to give you a private preview, Marlowe. Ed's a courtesy. His eyes swept over the displays, lingering on Silas's miniature in the window. "Though I see you're busy playing with dollhouses." Silas moved closer to Marlowe, his presence steady and grounding. She felt his hand brush against hers, a silent reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. "That dollhouse," Richard said, his voice sharp, "contains more genuine Fairhaven history than your entire proposal." Max's smile didn't waver. "History is wonderful, but it doesn't pay the bills, does it, Marlowe? How long can you keep operating at a loss? How long before you have to admit that some things need to change to survive?" "Some things," Marlowe replied, thinking of all the stories in Silas's notebooks, all the memories preserved in his restorations, "are worth more than survival. And some things," Max countered, pulling out a thick envelope, "are inevitable. My final offer, Marlowe. Enough to clear your debts and start fresh somewhere else, somewhere more suited to your potential." The same words he'd used when he'd proposed 2 years ago, promising her a life beyond Fairhaven. She'd almost believed him then, almost let him convince her that staying meant settling. But now she looked at Silas, who met her gaze with quiet certainty, at Pearl, whose cafe had served 3 generations of Fairhaven residents, at Richard, who kept his late wife's memory alive through small kindnesses and morning visits. Then she looked at the photograph of her mother, the one Silas had finally helped her frame, now hanging beside the register. In it, her mother was laughing, surrounded by vintage dresses and morning light, as if she knew something wonderful that the camera couldn't quite capture. "No," Marlowe said simply. "No." Max's confident smile faltered slightly. "Don't be hasty. Think about—" "I have thought about it." She moved to stand beside the miniature store, her hand resting on its perfectly crafted roof. "You see a building that needs updating. I see a legacy that needs protecting. You want to preserve the character of Fairhaven. We're the character. Every scratch on these floors, every story in these walls, every piece that Silas has restored, that's Fairhaven's character." "Very poetic," Max said dryly. "But poetry doesn't pay property taxes." "No," Pearl spoke up suddenly, "but loyalty does. My customers don't come to my cafe just for coffee. They come for the stories we share, the memories we make. And they don't bring their family heirlooms to me just for restoration," Silas added, his quiet voice carrying unexpected strength. "They bring them because they trust us to understand what makes them precious." "Trust won't stop progress," Max insisted. "Change is coming, whether you want it or not." "Maybe." Marlowe straightened her shoulders, feeling the soft seafoam fabric move with her. "But it won't come by erasing what makes this place special. The Heritage Festival isn't just a celebration of the past, it's a promise to the future, a promise that some things are worth preserving exactly as they are." A complex emotion crossed Max's face, frustration mixed with something that might have been regret. "You have until the end of the month," he said finally. "After that, the bank will foreclose, and my offer price drops significantly." He placed the envelope on a nearby display table. "Don't let pride cost you everything, Marlowe." After he left, the store fell into heavy silence. Pearl wiped tears from her eyes. Richard stared out the window, his expression distant and Silas had gone completely still, the way he did when emotions threatened to overwhelm him. "We have 3 days," Marlowe said finally. 3 days to show Fairhaven what we're fighting for." She picked up Max's envelope and deliberately dropped it into the vintage wastepaper basket beside her counter. "Let's make them count." Silas moved to stand beside her, and she felt his hand slip into hers, warm and sure. Pearl straightened her apron with determination. Richard's face broke into a slow, proud smile. "Well then," Richard said, "I believe we have a festival to prepare for." As they returned to their work, arranging displays and polishing frames, Marlowe caught Silas watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. Later, when the others had gone, he handed her a letter, not from his old collection, but one written that morning. "For courage," he whispered, She opened it carefully, reading his familiar handwriting. Some people speak loudest through their actions. You speak through every dress you preserve, every story you protect, every smile you share. Your voice, Marlo James, is in everything you choose to keep alive, and I've never heard anything more beautiful. The festival was 3 days away, and they had a battle to fight. But in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their shared dedication to preserving what mattered most, Marlo felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. Absolutely certain she was exactly where she was meant to be. 2 days before the Heritage Festival, Marlo found herself standing in Silas's workshop long after closing time, surrounded by scattered papers and half-finished displays. She wore a dress the color of autumn sunsets, its vintage fabric catching the lamplight as she paced between their collected memories. "Something's missing," she murmured, studying their presentation layout for the 100th time. "We have the restored pieces, the vintage clothes, the family stories, but—" she trailed off, frustrated by her inability to name what she couldn't find. Silas looked up from where he was carefully mounting photographs for their display. In the warm workshop light, she could see traces of gold leaf on his fingers, remnants of his day's work. "Tell me," he said softly. "It's just—" Marlo picked up one of his notebooks, fingers tracing the careful writing. "All these stories we're telling, they're beautiful, but they're about the past. We need to show people that preservation isn't just about looking backward. It's about—" she gestured helplessly. "But moving forward," Silas finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. He reached for his ever-present key necklace, and for the first time, Marlo saw him actually remove it. "There's something I need to show you." He crossed to a door she'd never seen him open, tucked away in the corner of his workshop. The key fit perfectly, and as the door swung open, Marlo gasped. Inside was a small room filled with light boxes, dozens of them, carefully arranged on floating shelves. Each one contained a scene crafted in miniature, but unlike anything she'd seen before, these weren't just restorations or replicas. They were dreams captured in wood and light. "Every time someone brings me something to restore," Silas explained, his voice growing stronger as he shared this secret part of himself, "I imagine the story behind it. The moments that made it precious." He guided her to one of the boxes, like this one. Inside was a tiny scene of Pearl's cafe, but not as it existed now. This version had tables spilling out onto a tree-lined sidewalk, strings of lights creating a warm glow. People gathered in comfortable conversation. It was both familiar and new, Pearl's essence preserved but reimagined for the future. "You've done all of Main Street," Marlo realized, moving from box to box. Each one showed a local business transformed but not erased, modernized but not sanitized. This is what preservation could really mean. "I never showed anyone," Silas admitted. "It felt too presumptuous. Who am I to imagine other people's futures?" "You're someone who sees the heart of things," Marlo said firmly. She stopped at a box that made her breath catch. Sweet yesterdays, but with wide windows that turned the whole storefront into a living museum. Vintage clothes displayed alongside photographs and stories. A space where history lived and breathed. "That one," Silas swallowed hard. "I made it the night after you first brought the misdelivered package." The tenderness in his voice made her turn to him. In the soft light of his hidden room, surrounded by his dreams made tangible, he looked both vulnerable and strong. "We need to show these at the festival," she said. Panic flickered across his face. "Marlo, Not all of them," she assured him quickly. "Just the ones that show what Fairhaven could be. Not Max's version of progress that erases everything, but real progress that grows from what we already have." Before he could respond, hurried footsteps approached the workshop. Pearl burst in, clutching a stack of papers. "He's done it," she announced, tears in her eyes. "Max convinced the Historical Society to support his development plan." They're saying his heritage-themed approach will better preserve the town's history than our outdated businesses. Marlowe felt the floor tilt beneath her. The Historical Society's support would make Max's plan nearly unstoppable. "They don't understand," Silas said, with unexpected fire in his quiet voice. "They haven't seen." He looked at his light boxes, then at Marlowe, something shifting in his expression. "Now, maybe it's time they did." He moved to his desk and pulled out a leather folder she'd never seen before. Inside were letters, dozens of them, but not the ones he'd written to her. "These are from my clients," he explained. "Thank you notes, stories about the pieces I've restored, about why they mattered." His hands trembled slightly as he opened one. "This one's from Claire Collins, written just before she passed. She wanted to thank me for restoring her mother's music box, and to remind me that sometimes the most important restorations aren't of objects, but of hope." Pearl wiped her eyes, then straightened with sudden determination. "I have letters, too," she said, "from customers over the years. Stories about first dates at my cafe, marriage proposals, family reunions, and I have the ledger," Marlowe added, understanding blooming. "Not just the accounts, but all those notes in the margins, births, weddings, celebrations, the whole history of Fairhaven, told through dresses and dreams and love." Silas finished quietly, looking at her in a way that made the word mean everything at once. They worked through the night, their festival presentation transforming into something newer and truer. Silas's light boxes became the centerpiece, surrounded by letters and photographs and stories. Each display now paired something preserved with something imagined, the past and future in constant conversation. Near dawn, as Pearl dozed in the corner, and the first light began to paint the workshop in gentle gold, Silas handed Marlowe another letter. "I wrote this one tonight," he whispered, "about why I finally opened that door." Marlowe read it by the growing morning light. "Sometimes preservation means keeping things exactly as they are. But sometimes it means giving them room to grow, like pressing flowers, not to freeze them in time, but to keep them alive in new ways. You taught me that, Marlowe. You taught me that the truest way to honor the past is to let it light the way forward. P.S. I love you. Some words need to be preserved in writing before they can be spoken aloud." She looked up to find him watching her, his eyes full of everything they'd both been too shy to say. Outside, the sun rose over Fairhaven, painting the old buildings in new light. They had one day left until the festival. One chance to show the town that progress didn't have to mean losing what made them special. But in that moment, standing in a room full of dreams made real and love made tangible, Marlowe felt something she hadn't expected, not just hope, but certainty. They would save their town, not by fighting change, but by showing how change could grow from love, love of place, love of community, and the kind of love that bloomed between two shy souls who found their voice in preservation. The day before the Heritage Festival dawned with an unexpected drizzle, the kind that made Fairhaven's old buildings gleam like pearls in morning light. Marlowe wore deep purple today, a color that reminded her of courage and twilight hours. She stood in Suite Yesterdays, watching Silas carefully arrange his light boxes in the window display, each one drawing small crowds of early morning onlookers. "Did you see the newspaper?" Richard asked, entering with their usual morning treats from Pearl's. His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. Marlowe's heart sank as she unfolded the Fairhaven Gazette. There, splashed across the front page, was a rendering of Max's heritage-themed shopping experience, all gleaming facades and corporate uniformity dressed up in historical costumes. The headline read, "Progress or Preservation, Town Divided Over Development Plan." "They quoted me," Silas said quietly, reading over her shoulder, "but I never—" His hands clenched at his sides. Marlowe found the quote, "Even local craftsman Silas Hartwell, known for his restoration work, has expressed concerns about the sustainability of maintaining historical properties without significant modernization." The words were technically true, taken from his bank board resignation letter, but twisted to support Max's agenda. "He's trying to discredit us before the festival," Pearl said from the doorway. She looked exhausted, having spent the night baking for the event. "3 customers already asked me this morning if I'm selling to the development group." The bell chimed again. Mrs. Henderson entered, clutching a vintage hat box. "Marlowe, dear, She paused, looking uncertain. "I came to return this. With all this talk of changes coming, maybe it's better not to make any new purchases." Marlowe felt the weight of what was really being said. Mrs. Henderson had been shopping at Sweet Yesterdays since before Marlowe was born. If she was pulling back... "Actually," Silas spoke up, moving to stand beside Marlowe, "I think you should see something first." He guided Mrs. Henderson to one of his light boxes, the one showing Sweet Yesterdays, reimagined. "This is what we're fighting for, not just to keep things as they are, but to help them grow while keeping their heart." Mrs. Henderson peered into the box, her expression softening. "It looks like how it feels to shop here. All those memories, but made new somehow." "Exactly," Marlowe said, drawing strength from Silas's presence. "Every piece in this store has a story, including that hat box." She opened it carefully, revealing a pale blue hat with delicate beading. "This style, it's from 1952, isn't it? The year you met Mr. Henderson?" The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "Our first dance. I wore a dress just that shade of blue." "How did you—" "Because my mother told me the story, and her mother told her." Marlowe took Mrs. Henderson's hand. "That's what Max doesn't understand. These aren't just old things we're preserving. They're the threads that weave our community together." The shop door burst open. One of the Historical Society board members, Augusta Pierce, who'd known Marlowe's grandmother, rushed in, looking flustered. "You need to see this," she said, leading them outside. All along Main Street, workers were installing banners for the Heritage Festival, but between them, overshadowing them, were new signs: "The Future of Fairhaven, opening spring 2026. Max's development company logo gleamed at the bottom of each one. "He's not even waiting for approvals," Pearl whispered. "He has them," Augusta admitted, shame coloring her voice. "The Historical Society voted this morning, early, before most members arrived." She turned to Marlowe. "I tried to stop it, but how could they?" Mrs. Henderson demanded, "without even hearing our presentation at the festival?" "Money talks," Richard said grimly, "and Max Reed has plenty of it." Marlowe felt the world spinning slightly. All their work, all their planning. Then she felt Silas's hand slip into hers, warm and steady. When she looked at him, she saw not defeat, but a quiet fire she'd never witnessed before. "Show them," he said softly. "What?" "Your mother's photograph, the one we finally framed. Show them why it matters." Understanding bloomed. Marlowe hurried back into the store, returning with the framed photograph she'd kept hidden for so long. In it, her mother's laugh seemed to ripple through time, full of joy and promise and defiance. "This was taken the day my mother turned down the first development offer," Marlowe explained, as a small crowd gathered. "In 1999, they wanted to turn Sweet Yesterdays into a chain store. She said no because—" Her voice caught. "Because some things can't be replicated," Silas finished, his quiet voice carrying surprising strength. "Only preserved." He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out what looked like an old journal, like this. He opened it carefully, revealing sketches and notes. "Every restoration I've done in Fairhaven, I researched its history first. The families who owned each piece, the stories they carried." He turned to a specific page, like Mrs. Henderson's first dance, or the chair where Augusta's father read her stories, the table where Pearl's grandmother taught her to bake. The crowd grew larger. People leaned in to see his sketches, to share their own memories. Augusta wiped tears from her eyes. "This is what we're presenting tomorrow," Marlowe announced, her voice growing stronger. "Not just old things kept unchanged, but living history, growing history." She gestured to the light boxes in her window. A future that grows from our roots instead of replacing them. They're installing the signs already, someone pointed out. Then we'll install our own, Pearl said suddenly. She disappeared into her cafe, returning with a stack of papers, letters and photographs from decades of customers. In every window, our real heritage. The idea caught fire. Within hours, Main Street transformed. Beside each of Max's sleek Future of Fairhaven signs bloomed displays of actual Fairhaven memories. Pearl's windows filled with photographs of 3 generations of customers sharing meals. The bookstore displayed letters from authors who'd done their first readings there. Even the hardware store hung up old receipts showing the dates of every home improvement project in town. As evening fell, Marlowe and Silas stood in his workshop, surrounded by the pieces they'd prepare for tomorrow's presentation. Through the window, they could see the street glowing with memories and hope. "I have something for you," Silas said softly, handing her another letter. "I was saving it for after the festival, but I think you need it now." Marlowe opened it with trembling fingers. "The first time you walked into my workshop, you brought the wrong package but the right heart. You saw beauty and preservation that matched what I could never find words to express. Tomorrow, I'll stand beside you and face my fear of speaking in public, not because I'm no longer afraid, but because some things matter more than fear. Love isn't just about preserving what's precious. It's about finding the courage to let it grow. You taught me that, Marlowe James. And whatever happens tomorrow, know that you've already preserved the most important thing of all, my heart. P.S. I've been practicing 3 words out loud. Tomorrow, after our presentation, I think I'll finally be ready to say them." Marlowe looked up to find Silas watching her with eyes full of tomorrow's promise. Outside, the drizzle had turned to soft rain, making the street's vintage lampposts glow like beacons. They had one night left to prepare, one chance to save their town's soul. But standing there, holding Silas's heart in written words while seeing it shine in his eyes, Marlowe knew that together they'd already preserved something even more precious than buildings or businesses. They'd preserved the possibility of love that grows while honoring its roots. And tomorrow they would show Fairhaven how to do the same. The morning of the Heritage Festival arrived with unexpected sunshine, as if Fairhaven itself was determined to shine. Marlowe stood before her mirror at home, fingers tracing the delicate beadwork of her grandmother's dress, a 1940s masterpiece in deep blue that seemed to hold starlight in its folds. She'd never worn it before, saving it for a moment that mattered enough. Today mattered enough. The town square was already bustling when she arrived. Booths lined the edges, each business displaying their history. Pearl's coffee and pastries filled the air with warmth. And there, in the center, stood a stage where each shop owner would present their vision for Fairhaven's future. Max was already there, surrounded by development team members in expensive suits. His presentation board showed glossy images of his heritage-themed redesign, now expanded to include even more of downtown than originally planned. "Quite the turnout," he said as Marlowe passed, his smile sharp as glass. "I hope you're not planning to make this harder than it needs to be. The Historical Society's already voted." After all, before she could respond, she felt a familiar presence beside her. Silas wore a blue shirt that almost matched her dress, as if they'd planned it. His hands trembled slightly as he carried one of his light boxes, but his eyes were steady when they met hers. "Ready?" he asked softly. "Together," she replied, and saw in his small smile that he understood all the layers in that word. They'd transformed sweet yesterdays into their presentation space. The front window display drawing crowds with Silas's intricate light boxes. Inside, every surface told a story. Vintage pieces paired with restoration projects, photographs alongside handwritten memories, the past and future in constant conversation. Richard arrived early, wearing his best suit and carrying a familiar wooden box. "Claire would want you to have this today," he said, opening it to reveal his wife's beloved pearl necklace. But she always said some occasions call for borrowed courage. As Marlowe fastened the pearls around her neck, more people began filtering in. Mrs. Henderson brought her entire bridge club. Augusta Pierce arrived with 3 other Historical Society members who'd missed yesterday's vote. Pearl's regular customers packed the shop, many clutching letters and photographs they'd brought to share. The festival officially opened at 10, but it was the 2 o'clock presentations everyone was waiting for. Max went first, his polished voice filling the square as he outlined his vision of progress. Change is inevitable, he concluded smoothly. We can either shape it or be shaped by it. My plan preserves Fairhaven's aesthetic while bringing it into the modern age. After all, his eyes found Marlowe in the crowd. We can't live in the past forever. Applause followed, though Marlowe noticed it came mainly from the suited investors near the front. Then it was their turn. As they climbed onto the stage, Marlowe felt Silas's hand brush hers. Just for a moment, just enough. She stepped forward, her grandmother's dress catching the sunlight. "Max is right about one thing," she began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "We can't live in the past forever. But preservation isn't about freezing time. It's about keeping what matters alive as we grow." She gestured to their displays, to the light boxes that had drawn crowds all morning. These pieces tell our story, not just sweet yesterdays or Hartwell restorations, but all of Fairhaven. Every restored frame holds a family's history. Every vintage dress carries someone's precious memory. But more than that, she turned to Silas, offering him the moment they'd practiced. He stepped forward, and though she saw the fear in his eyes, she also saw something stronger. Love for his craft, for their town, for her. "More than that," he said, his quiet voice carrying unexpected power. "They show us how to move forward without losing ourselves." He held up one of his notebooks. "In here are letters from every family whose treasures I've restored. Not just about the pieces themselves, but about why they matter." His voice grew steadier as he continued. "When the Morrisons brought me their family Bible, they didn't just want the binding fixed. They wanted their children's children to feel the same pages their ancestors had turned. When Mrs. Henderson brought her mother's vanity mirror, she wanted her granddaughter to see herself in the same light that 4 generations of strong women had." He opened his notebook, but instead of reading from it, he looked directly at the crowd. "These aren't just things we're preserving. They're the threads that weave us together, the stories that make us who we are." Marlowe felt tears prick her eyes at his courage, at the way his voice shook but didn't stop. She stepped forward again, standing beside him. "Look around," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "Look at what happened yesterday when we started sharing our stories. Every window on Main Street filled with memories. Every shop became a museum of moments that matter." She pulled out her mother's photograph, now beautifully framed by Silas. "This was taken the day my mother chose preservation over profit. Not because she was afraid of change, but because she understood that real progress grows from roots deep enough to hold it." She turned to Max's development team. "You want to preserve Fairhaven's aesthetic? We want to preserve its heart. You see buildings to renovate. We see stories still being written." Silas's hand found hers, warm and sure. Together, they unveiled their final display, a light box larger than the others, showing all of Main Street reimagined. Not Max's corporate uniformity, but a living tapestry of old and new. Sweet Yesterdays with its museum-style windows. Pearl's Cafe expanded into a garden space. Hartwell restorations with a teaching workshop for young craftspeople. "This is our vision," Silas said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not just preservation, but growth. Not just memory, but possibility. Because that's what love does," Marlowe added softly, feeling Silas's hand tighten on hers. "Whether it's love of place or craft or—" She looked at him, seeing everything they'd been too shy to say reflected in his eyes. "Or person. Love preserves what matters while giving it room to grow." The square had fallen completely silent. Then, from the back, someone started clapping. Mrs. Henderson. Pearl joined in. Richard. Augusta. The sound grew, spread, became a wave of something more than approval, recognition, understanding. The Historical Society needs to revote, Augusta called out, standing, immediately, with all members present this time. You can't, Max started, but his voice was drowned out by voices calling for an emergency meeting. As the crowd's energy turned to action, Marlowe felt Silas gently tugging her hand, leading her off the stage and through the square. They ended up in his workshop, surrounded by the familiar sense of wood polish and possibility. I practiced, he said softly, reaching for something on his workbench. Every morning before you arrived, I practiced saying it out loud. Saying what? He handed her a small box, not one of his light boxes, but something older. Inside was a ring, simple and elegant, clearly restored with loving care. It was my grandmother's, he explained, his voice trembling but determined. She gave it to me before she died, said to save it for someone who understood that love is about, he took a deep breath, about preserving what matters while letting it grow. Their eyes met, and in his, she saw every letter he'd written, every silent moment they'd shared, every truth they'd helped each other find. I love you, he said, the words clear and strong and perfect. Marlowe James, I love you. Outside, they could hear the crowd calling for the Historical Society meeting. Their future, both personal and professional, still hung in the balance. But in that moment, standing in the golden light of his workshop, wearing her grandmother's dress and Claire's pearls, looking at this man who had helped her find her voice while finding his own, Marlowe knew what preservation truly meant. It meant keeping your heart open even when you're afraid. It meant holding on to what matters while reaching for what could be. It meant saying the words that need to be said, even if your voice shakes. I love you too, she whispered, and when they kissed, it felt like the beginning of the best kind of history, the kind that grows more beautiful with each passing day. 6 months after the Heritage Festival, Marlowe stood in Sweet Yesterday's new window display, adjusting a vintage wedding dress that seemed to catch every ray of the morning sun. She wore emerald green today, a color that spoke of new beginnings and deep roots. Through the restored bay windows, now spanning the entire storefront, just as Silas had imagined in his lightbox, she could see Fairhaven coming alive. Pearl's Cafe had expanded into a courtyard garden, fairy lights twinkling year-round in the trees. The bookstore next door had knocked through to create a connecting door, their local history section now sharing space with carefully curated vintage pieces that told Fairhaven's story, and Hartwell restorations. Well, that had grown in ways none of them had expected. The bell chimed its familiar welcome. Richard entered, carrying his usual morning treats and wearing a knowing smile. "Big day," he said, setting down coffee and scones. "Though I suspect you've been ready for this one for quite a while." Marlowe touched the ring on her finger. Silas's grandmother's ring, now paired with a delicate band he'd designed himself, incorporating elements from both their families' histories. "Though the Historical Society meeting that day," she said, thinking back to the festival. "I never expected them to propose a preservation partnership." Richard's eyes twinkled. "I think Augusta had that idea the moment she saw your presentation. Living history, she called it. And look what you've done with it." Marlowe glanced around her transformed shop. The vintage clothing still took center stage, but now each piece was displayed alongside photographs and stories of its era. Silas's restoration workshop had expanded into the connecting space, allowing visitors to watch him work while learning about historical craftsmanship. Together, they'd created exactly what they'd promised, a place where the past lived and breathed and grew. The door chimed again. Max Reed stood in the entrance, looking slightly less polished than he had 6 months ago. "I drove by the Madison Hotel site," he said without preamble. "The community center renovation is coming along well." After losing the Historical Society's support, Max had faced a choice: adapt or leave. To everyone's surprise, he'd chosen to adapt. His development company now specialized in true historical renovation, turning abandoned buildings into spaces that served the community while preserving their character. The original ballroom fixtures you restored look beautiful, Marlowe told him, genuine appreciation in her voice. Time and transformation had softened the edges of old hurts. "Well," Max said, adjusting his tie, "I had a good teacher. Several, actually." He glanced around the shop, taking in all the changes. "You were right, you know, about preservation being about growth, not stasis. I just needed to—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, "to learn what was worth preserving." The bell chimed a third time. Silas entered, carrying a small wooden box that made Marlowe's heart skip. He'd been working on it in secret for weeks, promising to reveal it only today. "Ready?" he asked softly. Max took this as his cue to leave, but not before saying, "Congratulations, by the way, on everything." After he left, Richard made a show of checking his watch. "Well, would you look at the time? Those flowers Claire planted need tending. Regular, lengthy tending." He winked as he headed for the door, humming what had become his signature love song. Alone in the morning light, Marlowe turned to Silas. He wore a blue shirt that matched the sky, and his eyes held that mix of shyness and certainty she'd fallen in love with. "Close your eyes," he whispered. She did, heard him set the box down, felt him guide her hands to its surface. "Open them." The box was a masterpiece of his craft, intricate inlays telling the story of their journey. But it was what lay inside that took her breath away. A miniature scene, more detailed than any he'd created before, showing sweet yesterdays and Hartwell restorations as they were now, connected not just by a doorway, but by streams of golden light that flowed between them. And there, in the tiny window, two figures stood close together, one in a bright dress, one in a craftsman's apron, both exactly where they were meant to be. "For the wedding," Silas explained softly, "to show where our story began, and where it's growing." Marlowe touched the figures gently, feeling the love poured into every detail. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Not quite." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter, not one of his old ones, but something new, one last thing to preserve. She opened it carefully, recognizing the paper as a page from his restoration notebook. "Once, I thought preservation meant keeping things unchanged, safe behind glass, protected from time's touch. Then you walked into my workshop with a misdelivered package and taught me that real preservation is an act of love, keeping what matters while letting it grow. Today, we're getting married in the garden behind Pearl's Cafe, surrounded by all the stories we've helped preserve and all the new ones waiting to be written. You'll wear your grandmother's dress, beautifully restored, if I do say so myself, and I'll probably stumble over my vows despite practicing them for weeks. But that's okay, because you taught me that the most precious things don't need perfect words. They just need true ones. And the truest thing I know is this: I love you, Marlowe James. Not despite your passion for preservation, or your collection of bright dresses, or your way of seeing beauty in broken things waiting to be restored, but because of them, because you are exactly who you are, and you helped me become exactly who I needed to be. P.S. I've been practicing one more thing to say out loud. Want to hear it? I do." Marlowe looked up to find Silas watching her with eyes full of tomorrow's promise. Outside, Fairhaven bustled with morning life, Pearl serving coffee in her garden, the bookstore opening its connecting door, Richard definitely not tending to Claire's flowers as he chatted with Augusta about the Historical Society's latest projects. "We should get ready," she said softly. "The ceremony's in a few hours." "One more minute," Silas whispered, drawing her close. "I want to preserve this moment." As they stood together in the morning light, surrounded by all they'd saved and all they'd helped grow, Marlowe thought about preservation, about how sometimes the most important things to preserve aren't objects or buildings or even memories, but feelings, trust, hope, love, The kind of love that starts with a misdelivered package and grows into a future neither person could have imagined alone. The kind that knows when to stay silent and when to speak, when to hold on and when to grow, when to preserve what matters most while letting everything else transform into something new and wonderful. The kind of love that whispers, "I do," and means, "I will," every day. Choose to preserve this precious thing we've built together while letting it grow into everything it's meant to become. Outside, the sun painted Fairhaven in shades of promise. Inside, two hearts beat in perfect silence, preserving a moment that would soon become memory, then story, then legend, passed down through generations in a town that had learned to grow while keeping its soul intact. And if anyone noticed that the bride's bright laugh echoed her mother's photograph, or that the groom's quiet voice carried unexpected strength, or that their love story had somehow become part of Fairhaven's living history, well, that was exactly as it should be, because some things are meant to be preserved forever, not behind glass or in frames, but in the beating hearts of those who understand that the greatest love stories are the ones that never stop growing. The end. In our story, both Marlowe and Silas express their deepest feelings in unique ways, she through her vintage dresses and he through his restoration work and letters. What's your special way of expressing feelings that words alone can't capture? Have you ever found yourself understood by someone who spoke the same silent language as you? Your participation in this channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.